On this week's episode, Timmy and I are honored to host Ramesh Ponnuru. I am butchering the name. He will correct me. He is one of three writers that I absolutely adore. I'm excited to welcome to the podcast.
Bold, blind, and bonus.
TGIF, Timmy, how are you, my blind friend?
I'm good.
Yeah?
Yeah. It's a
What are you
beautiful
doing this
day in the
weekend?
upper Midwest, flyover country here.
The western branch of Bald, Blind, and Buddies, as it were?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, any big plans? It's, of course, not Father's Day. That was last weekend. But again, I'd like to reiterate that that's the single greatest, most important day of the year, is it not?
Yeah, definitely.
And I am beyond elated. We won't waste too much time doing our intro. I am beyond elated. I've been trying to get this fellow on for a bit. Schedules didn't present themselves as being amenable, but we are pleased and honored to welcome Ramesh Ponnuru. Did I pronounce your last name correctly, sir? I've seen it spelled. I just never spelled it out correctly.
It's Ponnuru, but you seized on a popular pronunciation.
I think that's the Americanization, is it not?
This is also wrong.
Yeah. Well, America can be wrong. But he is the editor of the National Review, a contributing author for and writer for the Washington Post, one of my favorite rags, as it were. And we've been trying for months to get him on, and we're finally able to welcome him into the podcast. So, Ramesh, thank you for joining us, good sir. How are you today on this beautiful Friday?
I'm doing great, and I'm glad to be on. And sorry it took so long.
No problem. You know, John, I was doing some research. You ready for these parallels?
I'm ready.
So the DC hero Superman grew up in Kansas, as did Ramesh. And Dean Cain, who played Superman, matriculated at Princeton University, just like Ramesh. So we've got our own superhero
Our own
here,
Superman.
John.
Yeah.
The logic is airtight. I fully endorse it.
Correlation.
Let me ask you a question. How does an Indian kid from Prairie Village, Kansas, end up going to Princeton and then get into politics of all things? It just doesn't seem to be, not to make generalities, it just seems to be a circuitous path. How did you end up doing that, sir?
Well, it was a great disappointment to my family that I'm not a doctor, like
I
everybody
don't mean to
else.
interrupt, sir, but we had another Indian on, Cherry and Koshi, and he said, I'm not a doctor, so I've let my family down. There must be an expectation that every Indian has to become a doctor. Is that sort of understood?
I think it has weakened over the generations, but telling my family that I was going to be a journalist was a little fraught because they expected something with a little bit more job security. But I've done fine. I got the political bug kind of early, and I wrote for an alternative newspaper in Kansas City, even when I was in high school. So I've been writing about politics and public policy for quite a long time now.
And eventually at the National Review, what is that like? What is your typical process like for being the editor?
Well, no,
it's got to be tough to be at the National
same.
Review in these times, does it not? Am I not incorrect? I mean, Trump is a lot of things. He's a Republican, but I wouldn't say he's a conservative, which I would anticipate you identifying as, if I'm not mistaken.
National Review over the last 10 years has occupied a somewhat lonely position on the right in that we haven't gone to my slightly unfriendly characterization of other people, we haven't gone crazy either for or against Trump in a way that a lot of people who I would have in the past considered pretty close philosophical allies have. Some moving because they're so anti-Trump in a more left and even partisan Democratic direction, and some deciding that essentially all criticism of Trump is pathological and a kind of betrayal. But I think there are a lot of conservatives who agree with our more measured take, where we agree with some of the things Trump does and disagree with others, and they've managed to sustain us.
I always see him as so transactional that you have to take it a piece at a time because there may not be the big picture out there. Like that. That's how I try to parse each decision separate from the gestalt. I don't know if that's reasonable or not.
Well, he's also mercurial, so you might find yourself agreeing with what he's saying about Iran on one day and then disagreeing with what he's saying the next.
Yeah, that's a good description, I would say. Mercurial. That's sort of an adjective. Yeah. It's funny you say that, Ramesh.
I learned my Bill Buckley words from
there
Bill.
you go. I was always fascinated by Bill Buckley. When Christopher Buckley endorsed Obama, I thought that was something interesting, just as an aside. But, I'm always curious because I tend to say the same thing. What offends me about Trump, like most people, I shouldn't say that's a bad lead-in. What I'm trying to say is politically speaking, he does things that every once in a while, I agree with. Most of the time, I tend to disagree. What I find to be objectionable, but I suppose at the end of the day, does this matter, is his presentation, his behavior. It seems to me this is a let's loot the place presidency and get out before we get caught. No bid contracts, things of that nature. Is there any sort of expectation? I don't anticipate he's 80 years old. Unfortunately, I think most liberals are going to have to accept the premise that Trump is probably going to get away with it. He may very well be above the law, and that's fine because life goes on. But is there any expectation that there's going to be sort of a look back at this if the Democrats were to win the House or the Senate? And this is not me endorsing the Democrats. I want to be as clear as possible. But do you see the next 2 years? Let's assume that the numbers prove to be correct, that the Democrats take the House and maybe it's a 50-50 Senate or somewhere in there, that there's going to be just nothing but investigations over the next 2 years?
Oh, I suspect that there will be investigations and that there will likely be at least a House vote to impeach the president. I think the interesting possibility here was something that we could have seen at the beginning of the Biden years and didn't, which was a concerted effort on the part of Democrats and Republicans to rein in some of the powers of the presidency so that, you had some Republicans who had philosophical or ideological concerns about the overextended presidency, and maybe some Democrats who had learned from the first Trump administration that it was dangerous to have that much presidential power. And by and large, we just did not see that. We saw a little bit of it with the reform of the Electoral Count Act to remove any confusion about the vice presidential role. But we didn't see a scaling back of the president's emergency powers that were improvidently granted by Congress in the 1970s. For example, there's been almost no movement on war powers. Arguably, what movement we've seen has been toward even further presidential power. And so given that precedent, I'm not especially hopeful that the Democratic reaction to Trump will be channeled in a constructive way, but I certainly hope that it will.
Yeah, it seems to be you realize what the last guy got away with, and then you keep going, right? That seems to sort of be the trend I observe.
To that end, Ramesh, do you think, and one of the things that I have done, and my brother suggested this, is take a step back from the news. I like to be an engaged citizen. Timmy may have mentioned to you that I taught at the university level politics and constitutional law and so forth. But I have found that my mental health, my blood pressure, all the sort of major metrics you start to focus on, in your 40s and of course in our 50s as we tend to be, that my blood pressure's gone down. My outlook on life has gone up, and it's simply just ignorance is bliss. Is that something you tell people to embrace, or is there something I should be doing as a political being, someone who's involved in the American political process, or am I sort of rescinding my duties? I'm just asking you almost as a priest, if you will. Give me some penance here. Am I okay in not paying attention? Because I have to tell you, it's been delightful.
Well, I think this is one of those many areas of life where one has to embrace moderation, because you can certainly get whipped up by a fervor for the cause du jour. And there are a lot of voices in our politics who want to make every particular statement or action by Trump into either, the best thing that has ever happened to our country that other traitors can oppose, or, the death knell of the republic. And I do think that waiting a little bit, seeing if the particular statement even gets followed up on, for example, all of that can be really helpful to people, and particularly in preserving their mental health. I don't recommend that people, keep cable news on 24/7, for example.
Well, it's funny, your colleague at the Washington Post, and then I'll defer you to you, Timmy, George Will, who's one of my favorites. If you can do anything to get him on, it's you. I've said this in my emails, and I'll say it on air. It's you, it's Bret Stephens, and it's George Will, because I find, that I can respectfully disagree with you, but understand the premise from which you're arguing. And I respect the hell out of that. I like people that, and it tends to be why I tend to like a conservative Supreme Court, even though I'm a classic small L liberal. He has long said, the presidency, the person in the presidency is temporal. And he said, as an exercise, try and remember what got you into a white hot lather during the George H.W. Bush administration, 30 plus years ago. And I think that's a good way to remember it, that Trump will come and go. So.
Yeah, and I mean, we had Warren G. Harding too, right? Like we've had other interesting presidents. I guess in the light of Trump, in his shadow, we're seeing in New York and other places this rise of seemingly embracing socialism. If you poll people under the age of 30, it's like a 40% favorable rate or something. Why do you think that is, and what do you think conservatives, how you choose to define it, can get the message out about this?
Well, I think there are a couple things going on. One, we have to remember that these are dark blue Democratic districts where the Democratic primary essentially settles the general election in advance. And under those circumstances, as particularly given what we know about low primary turnout, you don't have to have a huge segment of the population behind you in order to prevail, as long as you've got the intense and committed portions of the population. And so I think that we might be reading a little too much into particularly these New York primary results. Now, where I think that the results have a little bit more significance is in the statewide primary that we saw in Maine, where, of course, Graham Plattner won the Senate nomination for the Democrats, and the one that we're seeing play out in Michigan. There, we could see it's possible that you have a good enough Democratic year that these pretty left-wing candidates can win in swing constituencies. That would be a new thing. That's something we didn't really see before. In 2018, when there was all of this hoopla about the squad led by Ocasio-Cortez and Tlaib and Omar, those were districts, as Nancy Pelosi put it, that where a lukewarm glass of water with a D next to it could win the general election, much like Pelosi's own district. This would be something different and I think more ominous. But to get back to your other question about why the enthusiasm, I think you've got a couple things going on there too. One is just the fading memories of socialism as an actual threat and practice in the world. The fact that you don't have the Soviet Union anymore, that people who are old enough to have a living memory of that, or people whose parents were refugees from Central Europe, for example, they don't have the same kind of romanticization of socialism that some of these New York voters have. The other thing is, I think it's not even so much the attraction of socialism as a hostility and frustration with the status quo, particularly after the Great Recession of 2008 and then the slow recovery that followed it. I think it disillusioned a lot of people, particularly a lot of younger people, about whether the free market system worked. And so I think the response of conservatives to this new vogue for socialism is both the negative one of pointing out that socialism doesn't work, these solutions won't actually solve anything, but also that we do have real problems and we need to have more realistic solutions that build on what works in our system, including competition and choice and decentralization.
Yeah.
Well, so I appreciate that.
So to bring this back down to a more practical reality, housing, right? The fact that it's hard to afford housing underlies so many of people's complaints about this economy and whether they can start a family or expand their family. That's not a problem that socialism is needed to solve. That's a problem in our country that is largely caused by excessive government regulation and restrictions on home building that need to be swept away.
So, yeah, that's certainly an issue. Also, I think, they would argue that private equity's involvement in the real estate market, too, has impacted prices, too, right?
Yeah, they would argue that. I don't think that the actual evidence suggests that that is a major source of the problem, whereas I think there is robust evidence that local restrictions on building through zoning laws and building regulations that can get excessive have really made these problems worse, especially in the fastest growing
like
regions
California.
of the country.
Yeah, like it's atrocious in California. Like I think if you look at like the stats for LA County, right? Like
The Los Angeles area, the San Francisco area, and the New York area for that matter.
Yeah. If I may, Ramesh, I have my follow-up questions. I just have three. And it just happened this way when I was kind of drafting the questions that I wanted to ask you. And it tends to be about one current, one former vice president, and one person who applied for the job, Chris Christie, essentially. And I'm curious, I'll ask you about each in turn if that's okay, and I'll pass to Timmy in between. Is that all right by you, sir?
Sure.
Excellent. So you wrote an obit around Dick Cheney, which I have saved and I've used. It was phenomenal writing. If you have not had the chance to read it, we can link it in the show notes. But when Dick Cheney passed, you had talked about how he had the salience of January 6th was just something he was not willing to get past. It seems to have been bestowed upon his daughter, who has since lost her position. She is one of my political heroes, even though I do not necessarily agree with she or he on very much anything, to be perfectly candid. But one of my favorite lines is, there's a reason John Kennedy used to say, there's a reason that Profiles in Courage is just one volume because, you just don't tend to see political courage, as it were. But why do you think that was a January 6th? Because as Timmy can tell you, I have long maintained that to me was, in all but, reality, an attempted coup d'etat. Whether or not they succeeded to me is irrelevant. 9 people died, 6 directly as a consequence of that. Why do you suppose that the American public just kind of looked at Trump a second time? And this isn't by no means, and believe me, I understand when the choice presented was Trump versus Clinton in the first go-around, then, of course, Trump versus Kamala Harris in 2024. I understand how Trump ended up winning. But why do you suppose the American public just kind of went, who cares? To me, that's just something I can't get past, and it didn't seem Dick Cheney could as either. And what is your read on that? Why do you think the American public was so willing to just move beyond January 6th? Was it the economy, in the simplest terms?
Well, I think the answer is different when we're talking about Republican primary voters who not only renominated Trump in 2024, but never really seriously entertained any other candidates. And then secondly, the general electorate. Why, given the Harris-Trump choice, did they select Trump? And I think they're just two different answers to that. In the case of the primary electorate, look, I think, people will sometimes say, why does Trump keep harping on this election denialism about 2020, this ludicrous pretense that he actually won? As he puts it, he won by a landslide in 2020 when there's just no evidence of anything but the fact that Biden was duly elected in 2020, whether you like it or not. And people say, isn't this sort of absurd? Wouldn't he be doing much better if he didn't maintain this? And I think that's absolutely wrong. Because if Trump had ever acknowledged publicly that he had lost fair and square in 2020, or he lost legally in 2020, then the normal process that occurs in parties where you've lost a presidential election would have happened, which is the loser would have been rejected. There would have been an argument about why he lost, and the party would have turned to a new candidate. Particularly the modern political parties are pretty unkind to their losers. We didn't hear a whole lot about George H.W. Bush running again in 1996, for example. And we didn't even hear much about Al Gore running again in 2004, even though, in the case of Gore, there was a similar kind of mythology about how he had really won. Trump succeeded in that. You had a primary electorate, the vast majority of which believed the election had been stolen from Trump. And if you believe the election was stolen from Trump, if you believe that he was a good president, if you believe that, yes, he had his flaws, but he was more sinned against than sinning with all the lawfare, all three things that most Republicans believed in, you need a pretty strong counter-argument to nominate somebody else. And I think all the other Republicans who never challenged the mythology about 2020 made a real strategic mistake in not thinking that through. Then when you get to the general election, I think it's a pretty easy explanation, which is that the Biden Democratic administration was seen as a failure. And, look, a lot of these voters were not necessarily, but they were new voters. They weren't voters who necessarily followed the news all the time, but they knew that prices were going up too fast. They knew that the Democrats were not serious about controlling the southern border, and they made a choice based on the issues that were of most concern to them at the time, given the two very flawed choices that they had before them. So whether or not you agree with those choices, I think you can understand them.
But you make a fundamental differentiation between the primary voter. So in a lot of ways, what I'm hearing, and I'm not saying you're wrong, obviously, is that Trump may have played it correctly by just refusing to admit that he had been defeated. He basically inoculated himself from legitimate challengers. Is that a fair assessment?
I think it was politically shrewd, but morally corrupt.
Okay, fair. I like it. That's a very good way of putting it. I like it.
Well, and I think, a lot of successful, I'm going to use the word demagogues, have a scapegoat or something to point to, right? That they were slighted or there's this out there. And as long as the emphasis stays there, then the spotlight is not on Trump himself, right? So in that way, it may be very shrewd too.
Oh, well, he has a lot of scapegoats, right?
Yeah,
There is nothing this administration has ever done wrong that can't be blamed on the Trumpers or the deep state or
traitors,
immigrants, vote fraud, right?
Yeah. And speaking of casting blame, thinking about Graham Plattner, and John would bring J.D. Vance into this discussion, but there's this race to the moral bottom. I think you've talked about, and I always say that when you're a moral relativist, the only sin you can be guilty of is hypocrisy. And it seems like in the Democrat space and Republicans, both sides are guilty of hypocrisy because they seem to ignore concerns on their own side. And then in case like Graham Plattner, they give him a pass. Can you talk to this sort of phenomenon?
There, not only is there a certain hypocrisy, but there's even hypocrisy about hypocrisy. Because the Republicans, for example, will say, oh, you Democrats are always criticizing Paxton in Texas, but not Plattner. And then the Democrats will say, why should we be against Plattner if you guys are for Paxton?
Yeah.
Right? You got the names and the parties reversed. And in this exact way, each side's flaws and corruption and sins are used as justifications for the other sides. That's what I've described as the moral race to the bottom. This sense like, well, they don't have standards. Why should we?
Right.
Timmy's right, and Timmy knows this, that I hate whataboutism. I genuinely do. But you're absolutely right, Ramesh. And the more I see it, the Democrats justifying behavior when, Graham Plattner, who could be the next senator from Maine, I doubt it. I think Susan Collins is a political survivor. She never ceases to amaze me, and I'd be fine with her winning.
But she's a Democrat.
Well,
name only.
Okay. But again,
well, she's certainly the most moderate or most liberal member of the Republican Senate caucus.
Yeah.
Yeah, but they were a dime a dozen during the 80s with Reagan. That's what people forget. And this is part of the things that I lament is that Democrats, both parties seem to have gone to their polls. And by their polls, I mean their extremes. And if you don't agree with it, you're excommunicated, as it were. I'm always reminded of the Reagan line that the Republican Party is in the search for converts, whereas the Democratic Party is always in search of heretics. And the reason I bring that up is, for me, the differentiation between Graham Plattner is as bad. And again, I tend to be a libertarian in the sense that I think people's personal lives are just that. They're their personal life. I did not care what Bill Clinton did. I understand the power dynamic between he and the intern. But by the same token, I'm trying to be intellectually consistent. I do. I think people's personal lives are just that. To that end, however, where I make a differentiation between Graham Plattner is he doesn't have power. Someone like J.D. Vance does. And my question to you is, do you think J.D. Vance's conversion to sort of Trump, if you will, or Trump part two is legitimate? Or do you think that because every week we nominate the whack job and the hero, and every week I tell Timmy that J.D. Vance could qualify for me as the whack job of the week. And, he is the vice president of the United States. He deserves due deference. I get all that. But do you think his conversion to Trump is legitimate, or do you think that he is just the personification? Because Mitt Romney suggested this, that there's no bottom with J.D. Vance.
Well, I think in my experience of talking to politicians and observing them over the years, they persuade themselves of the things that they're saying. And particularly if they say the same things long enough, they persuade themselves that very few people are actually capable of maintaining in public something that they just don't believe at all. And I think in Vance's case, he more or less openly said, I need to track down this quote, but I think in 2021 or so, he said, I needed to make a decision. If I wanted to represent these working class voters and do good for them, I needed to get behind the guy that they saw as their champion. And it was an almost kind of open acknowledgement of the thought process. And I think if you've made that calculation, and then a lot of other things follow from that.
Yeah, he had actually said that Trump was essentially heroin for the masses, as it were.
Oh, he said a lot of stuff in 2016 and 2017 that was was more hostile to Trump than things I would say.
But just in the last week, and this is just where I want you to comment, and I don't want to put you in a difficult position because I understand you may have to interview him. He is the Vice President of the United States, and again, I respect the office. I've never agreed with the notion of some of my fellow, classic liberals that he's not my president. Yes, he is. You may not like the process, but he is, in fact, Trump is, in fact, the president, as is J.D. Vance, the vice president. But just in the last week, he has all but gone out and scolded Israel. And I make the joke that Seinfeld always jokes at your first and your last birthday, people come to your birthday party and they say, these are the people that like you. You like these people, right? And I get that sense with J.D. Vance telling Israel, you like this deal we made with Iran. And that's number one. And then number two, just today or yesterday, he gave an interview in which he suggested that the crimes that brought down Nixon, or supposed crimes that brought down Nixon, would have been a 12-minute story in today's news cycle. That may very well be true, but it doesn't make it any less of a crime, does it?
So first on Israel, I think that this is consistent with a style of rhetoric that we have seen from Trump and Vance across multiple domains. It's just we're not used to it being applied against Israel, particularly by Republicans. And that, I think, is what's jarring. It actually sort of reminds me in a way of an observation somebody made about Pat Buchanan in the 1990s. When he went into every argument with this sense of being a kind of resentful underdog, and that could land you in indefensible territory pretty quickly when all of your arguments are with minorities or Jewish people. And I think we're seeing something along those lines happening here. The other thing I would say, this was the Nixon comment. I mean, I think that is correct, right? And I remember, I think it was an off-the-record comment a top official in the Clinton administration made during the Lewinsky impeachment battle to a colleague of mine who said Nixon wouldn't have been impeached with an economy like this. I do think there were a lot of contingent circumstances in the mid-1970s that made it possible for that to be really the only effective use of the impeachment process in U.S. history. So, I mean, just as an analytical matter, I think that's right. But I also think, you're obviously correct that does not mean that all corruption that doesn't get impeached is legitimate. And this brings us also back to January 6th. There's been an attempt in some quarters to say, well, the public's ratified this. There's no reason to keep harping on it. And I just think, well, that's the truth is the truth. Even if it were the case that 49% plus of voters had said January 6th was no big deal, which is not what they were asked to say in November of 2024. But even if they had said that, so what? You've got your independent judgment. You don't have to forget something just because the plurality is voted a different way.
And shifting gears, I guess, I'm catching up on some of the writing you've done on healthcare, and I'm an active clinical psychiatrist who takes Medicare. And I always see these, I don't see them, somebody tells me about them, bumper stickers that say things like Medicare for all. And that just keeps me up at night. Like Medicare is such a mess. that it would be catastrophic, I think, for Medicare for all. And so as these, as these questions get raised, once again, how do we explain that? What solutions are possible? How can, we approach healthcare in this way?
Well, I could go on for a whole show, and probably longer, about what's wrong.
We could have you back on if you'd be interested
with
Ramesh,
Medicare for all, but
we could get nerdy.
Because John has said this too. You've said this, John. You've suggested Medicare for all. So
No, what I have said, and I'm sorry to interrupt, Ramesh, but what I have said is we had the worst possible of all systems prior to Obamacare. With its many warts and its many flaws, I think Obamacare was at least a tangible step in the right direction. And hear me out on this before you both rip my head off. One of which is we had 45 to 50 million people without health insurance. Now, my wife is a healthcare provider, as is Tim. And I don't know if you know this, Ramesh, but Timmy is only the second person ever to become a medical doctor blind. Did you know that? Isn't that cool?
I did not know that.
Yeah,
wow.
Yeah. He graduated valedictorian at Notre Dame. I'm just a dipshit with a dad bod who happens to be bald. That's where the name comes from. But what I was getting at is there's 50 plus 52 million approximately when the law went into effect that did not have health insurance, which in essence means they have socialized medicine. If you show up at a hospital, they cannot be refused service. You had the additional 40 to 45 million low income that qualified for Medicaid or for state or federal assistance. And then you had Medicare, which to me is just, of all the people to insure as a totality, I understand they were buying votes in the 1960s, but you don't insure the most costly segment of the population with the most medical problems and give them, in essence, socialized medicine. So my contention was that half of the country, when you take those numbers and add them together, were receiving some form of socialized medicine, whether you want to call it Medicare or what have you, and that the other half was paying for it. What I'm getting at is with its many flaws, Obamacare at least mandated that people had a skin in the game. Do you not see it that way, Timmy? First, and then I'll pass it to Ramesh.
Yeah, I mean, I understand the premise, and there was a Heritage Foundation suggestion of some similar idea back, decades ago. So, but let's let Ramesh.
Yeah, he's our guest, not you and I. We can argue about this. We did this every Friday, Saturday, Sunday in college. So,
well, look, I mean, I certainly wouldn't defend the pre-Obamacare healthcare system, which had a lot of the flaws you're mentioning. I think flaws that in a lot of cases had to do with overregulation, over-centralization, too much spending, a tax exclusion for employer-provided health insurance that may have made sense during World War II, but has created a lot of problems. And I think Obamacare, did try to address some of the problems that system created. I think introduced some new ones. But I think that Obamacare has sort of been absorbed into the larger healthcare system now. And the question of where do you go from here, I think doesn't fruitfully start with what you thought about Obamacare in 2009 and 2010. So, for example, if what we're debating is Medicare for all is saying 200 million plus Americans should find their current health insurance arrangements prohibited, made illegal. And that includes Obamacare policies, right? That includes policies that are bought on the Obamacare exchanges. And the fundamental, I think, unseriousness of this proposal is what problem requires that solution. We're talking about more than 200 million Americans, most of whom actually tell pollsters consistently that they're satisfied with their health insurance. Why should that be stripped away from them? You don't need to do it in order to extend insurance to people who don't have it. We've seen that in the past already. There's lots of ways you can expand coverage without doing that. Not only do you not need to do that in order to control costs, it gets in the way of controlling costs, as you'd expect when you create a bunch of new subsidies. So what's the problem that requires this drastic solution? And I think fundamentally, if I could put words in people's mouths, but I think this is right, that fundamentally it is an ideological hostility to for-profit businesses and an ideological predilection for nationalization and centralization, because it can't really, I think, rationally be defended on any other grounds.
And it's funny you say that, because I can actually see that, not per se in my own viewpoint. I have made the argument before, and I just as a overarching philosophy. To your point earlier, you had one of my favorite lines that I use regularly, which is, it was politically astute but morally bankrupt, what Trump did. Simply because you were able to get away with it doesn't make it right. But that is one of the things that I say all the time, which is I find it very difficult to justify, just philosophically, the idea that healthcare and people's well-being is a for-profit industry. But again, the devil's in the details, to your point, and your comment is well received, because I do think that that's part of it, that people have just an animosity, if you will, towards private enterprise. I agree with that. So.
Well, yeah, and I mean, man, the level of regulation that already exists and cludges up what's theoretically called free enterprise is just so tremendous right now too. It is quite a drag on a system that we want to work.
And to get back to the Obamacare question, to get back to just make the underlying philosophical point, if we were talking just about spending federal money to make sure that everybody had a basic level of coverage, that they were insured against the cost of catastrophic health expenses.
Catastrophic care, which is, 50% or more of healthcare costs, right?
My objection to Obamacare was not the limited extent to which it approximated that. It's that you had a heavily regulatory approach that actually made catastrophic insurance harder to come by. It required everybody to get more expensive insurance policies that might not suit their actual needs and circumstances. And so if I could live with a policy that involved more federal spending than we had in 2008 on healthcare, for example, if there wasn't this drive to centralized cost increasing regulation.
Final question for me, good sir, and I can't thank you enough for your time. I absolutely love intellectual conversations like this, and you are one of the best. I mean it when I said it earlier, my three favorites, you're one of them. To that end, what do you make of people that sort of have become, and again, I appreciate your candor and, you don't have Trump derangement syndrome, but when you criticize Trump, it doesn't mean that you are a traitor to the cause. That seems to be politics as it exists, and it's just become more extreme, I think, in the last 10, 12, 15 years. But to that end, what do you make of people, and I know he's your colleague, so I asked this gingerly, but what do you make of people like Chris Christie, who, was being considered for vice president of the United States under the first Trump administration and has since become a very big critic of his? Do you find that to be sort of J.D. Vance in reverse, or do you think that's legitimate? Because I find it difficult to justify how people can go from saying that Trump is toxic and heroin and blah, 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 to becoming his vice president and all but kissing his you-know-what. And in reverse, I think the same thing. I tend to like Chris Christie. I'm from New Jersey myself, and so I like straight shooters. I think he is one of them. I think he's a savvy political operator. But do you think, what do you make of people that are like that now, that have done the other side, the J.D. Vance in reverse, if you will?
Look, the Trump phenomenon is a political earthquake, and I don't begrudge anybody who was shocked or has been shocked, surprised, disoriented, and has tried to kind of rethink things and maybe even retrace some of their steps. How did we get to this point? And so the people who, in reaction to Trump, moved left, I don't think in principle, it's all opportunism, it's all corrupt. But I do think people, and I'm not speaking specifically about Chris Christie, but I think we all know
generalities
this phenomenon.
are fine. Yeah, people
do owe us an account of when they change their mind on some important things. So, for example, Bill Kristol is just one example of somebody who comes to mind. I do not understand changing your view of the moral and appropriate legal status of abortion based on Donald Trump. I do not understand changing your mind in either direction because of anything about Donald Trump or about what the Constitution means with respect to abortion policy. And it seems to me, not just on that question and set of questions, but on a whole range of things, there are a lot of people who, let's just say, they need to show their work.
Fair enough. We're keeping receipts. But is it not possible that, the Reagan adage, and I'm just playing devil's advocate because I understand it and I happen to agree with you fully. And that's kind of how I feel about January 6th. The Reagan adage, I didn't leave the Democratic Party. It left me. Could not, I would find it very difficult, as you're saying, to be able to say that with a straight face about something as foundational to your belief system as, say, abortion rights. I agree with you. But is it not possible that, George Will, your colleague, has left the Republican Party? That doesn't mean he's changed his stance on abortion. In fact, I know he has not. But is it not possible that the Reagan phenomenon is at play because Trump is such a, as you say, political earthquake? Excuse me.
Oh yeah, no. Look, I mean, again, I think it makes sense to reevaluate a lot of alliances and affiliations when circumstances change. Absolutely. I just think, for example, let's say you are a pre-2016 conservative who is dismayed by a lot of things going on in the Republican Party, whether it's Trump or protectionism or buying stakes in companies or what have you, and you decide that these things are so bad that even with all the flaws of the Democratic Party, you're going to root for the Democrats from now on. Does that mean you have to start making excuses for Graham Plattner, for example? I don't think so.
Fair enough.
And I think when people make that kind of jump, you have to wonder, one, sort of, were they always did they just stop being sort of hacks for the right and for the Republicans and to become hacks for the left and the Democrats? Is there a kind of ideological tribal mania that keeps them from taking consistent positions of integrity? That's the kind of jump that I think I have a harder time with.
Fair enough.
Because I think we have, with all this data out there, and we can pull up takes from years and years ago, I think it's easy to trap people and say, well, this isn't what you said then. And I think it's fair to say, well, I've changed my views and here's why, right? And that's the thing we're lacking with people like Chris Christie sometimes, right? Or Bill Kristol. The actual justification for the change, because to live is to grow and change and learn things, and that's why we're doing this. Right?
Show us your writing, show us your notes.
Yeah.
Rolled in receipts. Final question for me, good sir, and I thank you. Give me two things. Give me reasons for hope. I have a lot. I have 3 children. I am not a dismayed individual. I will be very happy to see the end of the Trump administration. Let me put it to you that quite candidly. That does not per se mean that I'm rooting for a return to the Biden administration. But give me some reasons for hope. Who do you see as quality candidates? Say what you want about Obama and McCain in 2008, but The Economist ran a headline that said, "This is America at its best." And I happen to agree with that. Whether you love John McCain or you disliked him or you disliked Obama and you thought he was full of hot air, whatever it may be, I thought they were 2 quality candidates and truly representative of American ideals. Do you see anybody on the horizon, Republican and Democrat, and you can hold court, maybe somebody I had not heard of, that I should keep an eye on, that, if they decide to run for president, they may not win, but gosh, they'd be worth sort of signing up for their campaign?
Well, it strikes me that people can emerge pretty rapidly. Think of the Obama phenomenon. In spring of 2004, he's a private citizen, just he's running for office. He's not even a U.S. senator yet. And in 2005, the leading Republican candidates for the nomination the next time around that people are talking about are Bill Frist and George Allen, neither of whom would even be in public life by the time the 2008 election comes around. So it could be any number of people. I think the more fundamental ground for hope here is if we take a step back and look at we the people. I think there is a certain degree of good sense in what the public has done, in the public's rejection of Hillary Clinton in 2016, and its rejection of Donald Trump in 2020, and its rejection of the Democrats in 2024. I think if you look at the polling, you see a consistent group in the middle. It may be small, but it's decisive, that is not in thrall to either party's orthodoxies and its worst vices, that sees perfectly well, for example, Donald Trump's flaws, but also sees the flaws of the U.S. left. And that seems to me to suggest that there is a potential majority that can be formed that stands for something more sensible and constructive. but it's going to be, a circuitous and rocky path to getting there.
I appreciate that. That was very well said. Thank you, sir. Erudite is an understatement. I appreciate that. So,
thank you for having
Timmy,
me.
do you have any final questions before we let the good gentleman get back to his day and stop talking to two Notre Dame dipshits?
We should let him see if he has a hero or a whack job to share with our listeners. Yeah. Is there anybody you would like to call out for some level of criticism or heroism?
Because this is the big week where she was introduced to the U.S. public. I guess this Daria Liza Avila Chevalier is the whack job who comes first to mind. I mean, this is a prison abolitionist who cannot even give the simple answer yes when somebody asks her repeatedly, should murderers be imprisoned? So, this is a degree of a detachment from reality and ordinary practical morality that I think is really disturbing, and unfortunately is likely to have a spot in the U.S. House of Representatives next year.
Very much so. So appreciate it. I as someone who tends to be libertarian, left leaning, I tend to, as you say, you have to pick your sort of battles, as it were, and I tend to vote Democrat, given the choice between the two. It's, you have chocolate and vanilla, if you will, quite literally. But I knew we were in trouble, and by that I mean the Democratic Party, when there was a movement afoot to get rid of the police department. And I thought, nope, that's just not something that is going to resonate in Youngstown, Ohio. So I just, nuance is an underappreciated value. And, you can say that the police have a history of this and have done that and so forth. We still need the police. So here, that's an excellent whack job.
It comes down, yeah, exactly. And then it comes down to, what are you going to do then? What are you going to do with these people who kill each other, right? It's great you're getting rid of the prison. You still have the problem.
Yeah, so.
Send them
Ramesh,
for sensitivity training.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. Go ahead, sir. I interrupted you. I apologize.
I was just saying that the alternative would have to be something like sending them for sensitivity training.
And that always works out well, doesn't it? Well, Ramesh, it has been an absolute honor to have you on. Well, thank you from the Ball Blind and Buddies. You're welcome back anytime. And if you want to nerd out on healthcare, I am ready to go. So Timmy and I would welcome the opportunity to have you back. So I appreciate it very much, sir. And have a wonderful weekend.
Thank you. You too.
Yeah, we're glad to have you on.
Timmy, as you know, I have three writers, he, Brett Stevens, and George Will, that I absolutely adore reading, largely because they're conservative, but they tend to argue from a position of strength and knowledge. And I enjoy listening to that conversation. And I thought it was fabulous. And we invited him back on. He said he'd be interested. So what did you take from the interview, Tim?
I liked nuance, right? We're in this podcast because, we try to see nuance and make connection. And I think his ability to get into the details and see the nuance and yet the value of free market capitalism to solve problems and still comes through.
I knew you'd love that, Tim. No, and that was one of the things that I try, and he really was able to sort of put my mind at ease that, look, Trump is temporary. Yes, it might be bad politically if you're not on his side, but he has done some things you may agree with. He's done some things that you disagree with. And the key is being able to hold those two thoughts at the same time. That's really what I'm going to take from that discussion.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, so, well, Timmy, as always, have a wonderful weekend, pal. And thank you, Ramesh, again for joining us. And this is John Boland signing off saying, hey, misbehave, drive fast, take chances.
And this is Tim saying, if everybody likes what you're doing, you're probably not doing anything worthwhile. Let's keep talking.